still in the game. Somebody's pulling your chain. About 22nd century science.
Hello and welcome to 22nd Century Science, where we talk about astrology not being what you thought it was. Today we're going to look at the history of the subject, particularly the history of astrology and science. We can trace astrology back to about 2300 BCE to Sargon of Akkad. It turns up about 200 years later in Lagash. We see it in the Venus tablets of Amazaduga in about 1400 BCE. And then its first appearance in Egypt, if I use the David Roll date, is around about 1000 BCE on the Israel stela of Meneptah. We see zodiacs first in Egypt at Dendera from the Ptolemaic era, and horoscopic astrology starts around about then. Prior to that, it was really all associated with kings rather than individuals. Then we get to its formulator, the modern subject of astrology. We call it modern. The traditional modern subject of astrology has its basis in around about the 1st century of the current era, from people like Ptolemy and Vettius Valens. Ptolemy wrote a book, the Tetrabiblos, which is basically a book about astrology. And many of the books that followed in the Middle Ages, in fact all of the books that followed in the Middle Ages, were effectively based on it. We can't say that astrology was formulated by Ptolemy, although Richard Dawkins has said that. What we can say is that he has been the greatest influence on astrology. Now, he had to try and understand the world in which he lived and the subject matter that he was working with, and he didn't understand heliocentricity, because of course astrology isn't heliocentric, it's person-centered, but because of the fact that he had to work with the information at hand, he developed what we call the geocentric solar system, with the Earth at the centre, which was basically the ancient view anyway, but he created some elaborate mathematics to explain the motions of the planets. We have an ephemeris from about the 5th century of the current era, or fragments of an ephemeris, which is a document showing the positions of the planets and their predicted positions. During the Dark Ages, astrology was pretty much kept alive in the Islamic world, and there are several very prominent names in the history of astrology that come down to us from the years between 500 and 1100 of the current era. Al-Biruni, Masha Allah, Abu Masha are three. Astrology came back into Europe via Spain, along with the writings of Aristotle, and so our first prominent astrologers in the Western world are going to be people like Guido Bernati and Michael Scott, who both find themselves in the Inferno. Dante puts them in the Inferno for the sin of prediction. They're placed into the Inferno with their heads on backwards for preempting God, one would think. Later on we get people like Tycho Brahe, who was a great observational astronomer and who said of astrology, it's really rather more accurate than one would expect. His collaborator Kepler was also an astrologer, and he probably gave us the first progression that we can use with some confidence in a scientific way. Later we get William Lilly and Placidus to Titus, and then we get an interruption, and that interruption is still resonating with us today, and that's from Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Prime Minister of France, who I've mentioned before, who basically created the first Academy of Sciences. Now, he allowed certain subjects in, and astrology was probably the most prominent subject that wasn't allowed in. He viewed it as pseudoscience, and as I've probably said before, it is and was the most data-reliant subject that we have that has come down to us from ancient times. And so with that in mind, it's always going to be a problem for anyone sitting in the 1600s to understand the subject, because we've only just got to the place where we can actually understand the subject from a scientific point of view anyway. So it's perfectly understandable that someone in the 1600s would view astrology as a pseudoscience, quite simply because the data wasn't available. The systems weren't available to evaluate it. And so what you're going to get if you look at a subject from the wrong perspective, you'll get the wrong data back from it, you'll get the wrong information back from it, and you will label it as pseudoscience. And that's exactly what happened to astrology. And the implication of that, and what came after that, was that we could not do any work in that space because it wasn't funded. So it wasn't patronised, so it wasn't funded. So it never gained funding. Medicine, on the other hand, looked exactly the same as astrology in those days, but it managed to get into the academy, and so it managed to somehow, over a period of 130 years, become funded. It was part of surgery, whereas astrology wasn't part of astronomy. We lost astrology and we gained eventually psychology. We didn't gain astronomy. We gained psychology. So you can tell that there's nothing associated in astronomy and astrology really, apart from one is the technical part of the other one. So it's necessary to have astronomy in order to do astrology, but it's not the other way around. And so it can be seen as quite an easy move to just send astrology to go and work in the circus instead of the university. Because of course you wouldn't know any better in 1666. The next big development in astrology happens in 1930. Nothing happens in astrology for hundreds of years. And then 1930, a chap does a horoscope column, or does an article really, in 1930 in the Sunday Express, delineating the horoscope of Princess Margaret. And from that point in 1930, we get the horoscope columns, we get zodiac columns. Of course, zodiac signs have got very little to do with real astrology. They're actually, zodiac's a field, and it's the planets that are the players. You don't go to the game to watch the field, you go to the game to watch the players. The players actually pass to each other in astrology. They send diagonal balls and square balls to each other, which are basically aspects. And so it's quite a good analogy. And horoscope columns are really penalty shootouts where all of the players line up and take shots at the sun. Not really football, not really astrology either. So medicine was in a very similar position to astrology for 1,000 years. It looked very much like astrology. It was related to astrology. The four humours are related to the four elements. What we know about surgery is that it was advanced in 1666. We know this because basically war surgery had been going on for many years, and lots of wars. Here's an example. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, reports being operated on to remove a bladder stone the size of a tennis ball in 1658, and the same surgeon is recorded bleeding him in 1666. So we have a contradiction in terms of what surgery could do and what medicine could do. Basically, what happened after the Academy of Sciences in 1666 is pretty much nothing until about 1796. Around about the end of the 1700s, Edward Jenner rediscovered inoculation, vaccination, and from that point medicine took off. So it then exponentially, in the next 130 years, we get anesthesia, we get antiseptics, we get germ theory, we get antibiotics. So basically it did nothing until 1796, and then people started to realise that actually there might be something in medicine, it might be worth investing in. And that's the situation we find astrology in today. Abandoned by academia in 1666, no investment, no funding, no research. So the amount of research that's been done in astrology since 1666 is about the same amount of research that gets done in physics every 20 minutes. We know that there are about 800,000 physicists in the world, and we also know that there are probably more medical researchers and more pharmacology researchers. But we know that there are about 800,000 physicists in the world. So we can work out from that every century 120 billion hours of research is done in physics. We also know that there are about 1,000 experiments reported done in astrology, and none of them took as long as my experiment, which took 25,000 hours over 23 years, which is a good number of years. But I had a variable that I could experiment with. I had a variable that had enabled me to do a 23-year experiment, and there aren't too many people that have got a variable like that. So the idea that any of the other experiments took 25,000 hours is probably far-fetched. So what we know is that some of these experiments take an afternoon, and we certainly know that the maximum it could be is a tiny fraction of the number of hours in physics research done every century. And so we know that there is totally inadequate basis for all of the decisions made since 1666 that astrology is pseudoscience. You don't make that kind of a decision based on 0 hours research, which is effectively the difference between physics and astrology. 0 hours. The equivalent of 0 hours research is done every century in astrology. And it's believed by so many people that we live in a universe where astrology can't possibly be true, because it's believed that we live in a natural universe. I agree with that. I don't think astrology would develop in a natural universe. I don't think that consciousness has the characteristics that would enable it to develop in a natural universe. I think the sort of consciousness and the sort of construct that we live in is very much aligned with a simulation. And the reason for that is I've done the experiment in astrology, and the astrology is showing me that we live in a simulation. And it would show anyone who knows how to read it that we live in a simulation. Now, it's interesting that we would come at the idea of living in a simulation from the perspective of astrology, the exterior perspective, which is essentially the motions of planets in the system within which we live. But again, discoveries come from unusual places, and this is one of those places, I believe. So if astrology wouldn't develop in a natural universe, and would develop in a simulation, why aren't the people who are looking at simulations interested in astrology? Well, I think the simple fact is that we've not shown them the evidence yet that astrology is true. If they thought that astrology was true, it would be a no-brainer to jump to the idea that, well, wait a second, it could be a control program. And if it's a control program and we can understand the output, maybe we can understand the input. Now, we get into deep philosophical areas here where we start to question, well, what do we know? How do we know it? How can we possibly know stuff like that? And if we find it out, does the whole thing stop? As Douglas Adams, I think, pointed out at one stage in his 1979 book, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Here we are, or with this data that tells us something about relationships, human relationships, and it's telling us something about human consciousness, and it's telling us something that suggests that this is not a natural process. So astrology has always been aligned very much with gods and religion and things like that, because it looks like it's some sort of external element given to the human race, if you like, or given to people to enable them to predict or forecast their future. Now, to most rationalists, that sounds like poppycock. It sounds ridiculous. But then if you look at it from the perspective of, well, maybe it's a control program for a simulation, then it's not the same thing. We're not talking about the same thing, and we're not looking at it in the same way. So fast forward to the 1990s, when I started to look at this from an experimental point of view, and we have Richard Dawkins writing in The Independent that astrology is dangerous and astrologers should be jailed for fraud. Well, back in 1996, we didn't have the experimental outcomes that we've got today. We did have some. We had more than would be admitted by Richard Dawkins. But we have more now, and we have essentially a scientific theory of astrology. And so we are in a position now to challenge what Richard Dawkins said in 1996. But why did he say it? He said it because astrology fundamentally opposes his worldview and the worldview of materialist rationalists who do not believe in anything unusual about the universe. When I say unusual, I mean they know that it's a very unusual place, but they don't believe in anything that we might label as supernatural or paranormal, which in fact would, in this case, isn't supernatural or paranormal. It's quite normal. It's just a new way of looking at consciousness. And so back in 1996, when I read Dawkins's The Real Romance in the Stars, it spurred me on to go looking for that elusive variable, the variable that we could experiment with. And I knew it was there. I'd looked at enough astrology and I understood secondary progressions enough to know that there must be a way of doing an experiment that would demonstrate astrology. I wasn't sure how it would work out. I wasn't sure what it would look like, but I was pretty sure it was going to involve secondary progressions, because effectively the difference between the natal chart and the way natal charts are taught and progress charts are taught is that natal charts, you get quite a wide, what we call an orb. You get quite a wide orb in aspects in the natal chart. So 5-10 degrees, you can actually say that an opposition is in orb when it's 10 degrees from being exact, which actually gives it a 20 degree, it's 10 degrees either side, usually. So that's not much of an opposition really, that's just two planets at the opposite side of a chart. There's nothing exact about it. But with progressions, we demand a 1 degree orb. Why? Why would progressions be more accurate than natal charts? And then it all of a sudden occurs to you that, right, okay, yeah, the progress chart is accurate because people have been doing this for a long time and they've noticed that it only works if you've got a 1 degree orb, or a bit more than a 1 degree orb. We use a 2 degree orb basically in order to capture data. If we've got quite a slightly inaccurate birth times, we can capture what we're looking for within an orb of 2 degrees. But if you're an astrologer and you're using a natal chart that's inaccurate and a progress chart that's super accurate or super precise, so imprecise and precise, which is the right chart to use? It's the precise one. So when you're looking at a progress chart, you're looking at your actual horoscope, and you don't allow for 10 degree orbs or 5 degree orbs, you allow for 1 degree orbs. If you're looking at the natal chart, you can allow whatever orb you want because it's not your actual chart, it's your blueprint chart. So that's really important, and I think it's something that people overlook quite a lot within this subject, that the precise chart has been ignored and the imprecise chart has been used as the exemplar. So I looked at this skepticism, and I realised that it comes from one place and one place only, and that is lack of experimental outcomes. Now, it's fine for me to talk about this now because I've got experimental outcomes and people know that I've got experimental outcomes, and they've had a chance to peer review those experimental outcomes and they haven't been able to shoot them down. But when we didn't have experimental outcomes, critics were able to throw all sorts of stuff at astrology and it would stick. But after you've got experimental outcomes, all these criticisms is commentary on what happens to a subject when it's abandoned by academia. So if you visit the Astrology and Science Wikipedia page, it will tell you that scientific testing has revealed no support for the astrological premise. This is just not true. The problem is the people who are employed to report are different from the people who are employed to communicate that to the public. And so we have two different types of skeptic already in the system. And then there are the astrologers. Astrologers don't do research and they don't do experiments as a rule. Well, they didn't. They've started to now. But what we have here is a situation where certain people are employed to say the same thing over and over again about astrology and to essentially keep it out of academia. I don't know why they do it. I know one of them, the leader of this group, and there is a group that is devoted entirely to astrology, is a chap who lives near me, and he is a retired analytical chemist, I believe, and he is about 86 years old now, might be 88 years old now, and he is an ex-astrologer. So he's turned his coat already once. He can't turn it back. So he can't admit that he's been wrong, his life's work. So basically his life's work, it started off as an astrologer, then he turned to a critic of astrology, and he can't really turn back. And the same goes for a couple of the others. They're ex-astrologers who have very spurious reasons to reject it as a subject. And of course they weren't looking at it from our point of view, from the point of view that we're looking at it, that the horoscope changes. And because the horoscope changes, well, it's essentially a different dimension that you're looking at. So we're in that situation that Ellie Arroway was in with with S.R. Haddon in Carl Sagan's Contact, where she says, "You found the primer," and he says, "Clever girl." That is the moment that we're in now. We understand how to interpret astrology. We've got that. We need to take that somewhere else now. What these podcasts are going to do, and what these podcasts are for, is to show you how we found that, and to show you that we found that. But then something else has got to happen after that. We've got to take it somewhere. So anyway, as far as the history of this subject is concerned, it starts in 2300 BCE. We don't know where it came from before then. We just know that some things developed over time, and at some point around about the 1st century, it started to be written down in a way that it could be transferred to the future or translated to the future. So many mistakes were made in this subject, and there's been no chance to correct any of those errors because there's been no funding and no investment in order for us to be able to correct those errors. So effectively, the experiments that are being done, the very few, meagre number of experiments that have been done in the modern age, are effectively testing Ptolemy. They're effectively testing this guy from the 1st century AD, and everyone's saying he was wrong. Of course he was wrong. He was in the 1st century AD, 1st century of the current era. Of course he was wrong. What do you expect? Now, astrologers, unfortunately, don't do research. They're not what you might describe as scientific prodigies. But that's because the subject doesn't attract scientific prodigies. And the reason it doesn't attract them is it isn't funded to. And it never has been funded to. So the point is, it's in a loop, an infinite loop, that says you're not going to get funded, so you're not going to do any research, so you're not going to find out about yourself, so you're not going to develop, you're not going to evolve, because you're not funded, and you never were. And there's an infinite loop which stops progress. And it stops progress because astrology is seen as the antithesis of science, and that's a mistake. And of course there's the problem that physicists and scientists generally are basing their assumptions about astrology on a worldview, a scientific worldview that isn't current. Now, they don't say this because they're getting away with the fact that there are no experimental outcomes. So they don't have to justify the fact that it was rejected based on the billiard ball universe, not on the quantum universe. So as soon as we start to come up with experimental outcomes, then astrology starts to make sense. Now remember, physics enables us to describe and measure and predict events in nature. And astrology enables us to describe and measure and predict events in consciousness. Two different things. But of course, science doesn't want to give up consciousness yet, or natural science doesn't want to give up consciousness yet. They're going to have to eventually, but what we're showing is that astrology is demonstrating or showing events in consciousness. It's showing how we can measure them. And it's strange that it's an external measure. It's strange that it's something called astrological secondary progressions. It's very unusual indeed. It's very unusual. But we're showing them. And we've got a theory to back that up. So we can basically say falsify this theory. So we're in actually quite a good position as far as that's concerned. But remember, this billiard ball universe that rejected astrology, it's not relevant anymore. And it hasn't been for many, many years. But that's not the argument that anyone's put to this subject, because of course those experimental outcomes are the things that people are looking for and they want and they need to see. So do we know that consciousness is separate to nature, separate to brain? Well, there are some interesting stories. And remember, when it comes to human consciousness, it's always a story because it's always been related by some human being, except when we're looking at synastry, progressed synastry and progressed astrology. Then you're looking at a third party, which is the movement of the planets in a matrix. So, but basically, what do we know about it from human beings? There's a lady called Vicky Umipeg who was blind from birth, and in 1994 she told the story to Kenneth Ring, doctor, that she'd had a near-death experience, and that was her first experience of sight and light. She knew it was her laying on the bed because of the wedding ring. It had an orange blossom pattern on it that she had felt and recognised. So she effectively said, I'd never experienced sight or light before, and in this near-death experience I did. Now, she might not be telling the truth, but I think it would be very difficult for someone who's never experienced sight or light to be mistaken. So you have two choices really. She's either lying and looking for attention, or she's telling the truth. And the likelihood is, in this case, she's telling the truth. And if she is, then what's happened is consciousness is separated from brain. How can it do that? That's impossible. That's impossible with the sort of physical universe and the construct that so many materialist rationalists believe. There's a lady called Susan Blakemore who has a theory on near-death experiences. I don't think it's an adequate theory. Compared with the evidence for near-death experiences, I think Susan Blakemore's theory lacks, because it's basically just an idea. It's just an idea to counter something else. There's no real research behind it. It's just an idea. And that idea is the light's going off and oxygen-starved brain is having a hallucination, a final hallucination before you die. Yeah, maybe, but I don't see how you can see yourself. I don't see how your consciousness can separate and do that unless it actually is separate. And I think that's a question that a lot of people have got to answer. So I'll be back next week with another episode of the 22nd Century Science, where we say astrology is not what you think it is it?
It's still in the game. Somebody's pulling your chain. About 22nd century science.